The gavel came down twice before Jennie Hart shoved her way through the crowd gathered outside the Cedar Falls bank, her boots sliding on ice-slicked planks, her voice cutting through the freezing rain like a blade. "Stop this auction right now. That is my land you are selling, and my husband has been dead only 3 weeks." The auctioneer, a thin man named Prout with ink-stained fingers and a banker's cold eyes, barely glanced up from his ledger. "Mrs. Hart, the debts on the Hart claim total $412, owed to this bank and to the Cascade Mining Company. Without payment, the land, the cabin, and the livestock revert to the bank for auction. That is the law." "That is theft," Jennie shot back, rain plastering strands of dark hair to her cheeks. She had traveled 11 days from Seattle by wagon and ferry to reach this scattered logging town tucked into the folds of the Cascade foothills, only to find her husband's grave still fresh, and his entire estate about to be sold out from under her to strangers standing in the mud with their hands in their pockets. "I have not even been given the chance to review the accounts." A murmur rippled through the crowd of perhaps 30 men, mill workers and ranchers, and a few miners with coal dust still ground into the creases of their knuckles. Nobody moved to help her. Nobody dared cross the bank in a town this small, this dependent on credit lines that stretched thin as fishing line across the whole territory. Then a voice came from the back, low and unhurried, carrying the kind of weight that made men step aside without being asked. "Auction is closed today, Prout." Jennie turned, and so did everyone else, to see a man walking through the parting crowd like the crowd itself had decided to make room for him. He stood well over 6 feet, built through the shoulders and chest the way a man gets from years of felling timber and hauling stone, not from vanity but from necessity. His hair was dark and longer than fashion favored in the cities, curling damp against his collar from the rain, and a close beard shadowed a jaw that looked carved rather than grown. He wore a heavy coat of oiled canvas over a flannel shirt, and even beneath all that wool and leather, the raw strength in his forearms as he pushed his hat back was impossible to miss. He looked like a man the mountains had made, not a man who had simply settled in front of them. Prout's confidence flickered. "Wyatt Lockhart." "This is a bank matter. Sheriff Cade posted the notice himself. I know what the notice says." Wyatt's eyes moved to Jennie for the first time, and something in his expression shifted, just slightly, taking her in, the fine wool of her traveling coat gone dark with rain, the leather satchel clutched against her side stuffed with papers, the stubborn set of her jaw that told him she had not slept properly in days and did not intend to admit it. He looked for a half-second like a man cataloging whether she would be trouble or simply troubled. Then his attention returned to Prout. "How much is owed?" $412, and it is not your concern, Mr. Lockhart. It is now." Wyatt reached into his coat and produced a folded leather wallet, worn soft at the corners, and began counting bills into Prout's stunned hands with the same unbothered rhythm he might have used counting fence posts. "400. I will bring the rest by Thursday in coin, and you will give the lady a written receipt today, in front of these witnesses, so there is no confusion about the figure later." The crowd's murmur turned to open astonishment. Prout's mouth opened and closed twice before he found words. "Mr. Lockhart, this is highly irregular. So is auctioning a widow's home while she's still standing in the road holding her husband's death certificate." Wyatt's voice did not rise, but something in it settled over the crowd like a held breath being released. "Write the receipt, Prout." Jennie stood frozen, rain running cold down the back of her collar, staring at this stranger who had just handed over more money than most men in that crowd earned in half a year, for a woman he had never met, over a debt that was not his to pay. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt something closer to alarm. "I did not ask you to do that," she said. Once Prout had scuttled off toward the bank steps to fetch his ledger, the crowd beginning to disperse now that the entertainment had ended. Wyatt turned back to her, and up close she could see his eyes were a deep, weathered brown, the color of river stone, and there were lines at their corners that spoke of squinting into wind and sun for a great many years. "No, ma'am, you did not." "Then why?" Because your husband, Thomas Hart, cut lumber alongside me for 2 winters before he took sick. He was a decent man who got in over his head with the Cascade Mining Company, same as half this valley. Wyatt's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I owed him a debt of my own, this settles it. I do not need charity, Mr. Lockhart. It is not charity, it is a debt. He said it plainly, without heat, and turned to walk away toward a heavy bay horse tied at the rail, leaving Jennie standing in the rain with a receipt in her hand and 100 questions crowding her throat, none of which she managed to ask before he had swung up into the saddle and ridden off toward the tree line, disappearing into curtains of freezing rain as though the mountain had simply reclaimed him. Prut returned with the ledger and a scowl and thrust a paper into her hands. There. 400 paid against principal. You still owe $12 in accrued interest, and the note on the Cascade Mining Company advance your husband took for equipment repairs is a separate matter entirely, Mrs. Hart. $218 due within 30 days, or the company forecloses on the schoolhouse land itself, since your husband put up the deed as collateral. Jennie's stomach dropped. The schoolhouse land. That was to be for the settlement school. Thomas wrote to me that it was already secured, free and clear. It was, until he borrowed against it in August to pay for a mining claim gone bad. Prut did not look sorry, only tired, the way a man looks who has delivered bad news so many times it has worn a groove into him. You have 30 days, Mrs. Hart. I would suggest you find the money, or find a very generous friend. He walked off toward the bank, leaving Jennie standing alone in the rain, clutching a piece of paper that told her half her problem was solved and the other half was only beginning. She had come to Cedar Falls with a single purpose fixed in her mind, since the day the letter reached her in Seattle, informing her that Thomas had died of a fever in October, leaving behind unfinished business and an unfinished school. She had trained as a teacher in Portland, had spent 3 years instructing in a proper schoolhouse with proper desks and a proper stove, and when Thomas had written to her 2 years ago describing the settlement of Cedar Falls, the need for a school for the children of loggers and ranchers, and the few Indian families still working the salmon runs along the river, she had felt something in her stir that she had not felt since childhood, some old hunger for purpose beyond the comfortable and expected. They had married quickly, perhaps too quickly, 2 people who respected each other and hoped affection might follow duty, and then he had gone ahead to build the school while she settled affairs in Seattle, and then he had died before she ever saw the town at all. Now she stood in it, soaked to the bone, widowed before she had truly become a wife, and the schoolhouse she had crossed a territory to open stood in danger of being seized by a mining company before she had ever taught a single child to read. She spent that first night in the town's small boarding house, a narrow building run by a widow named Constance Ferris who fed her stew and did not ask too many questions, though her eyes were sharp with curiosity. It was Constance who told her over the second bowl of stew about the man who had paid her debt. Wyatt Lockhart, Constance said, refilling Jennie's cup with strong coffee. Runs cattle and timber up past the ridge, has for near 10 years now. Lost his wife to the influenza the winter of '81, and has kept mostly to himself since, though he is not unkind, only quiet. Does not come to town more than he must. She studied Jennie over the rim of her own cup. Surprised he stepped in the way he did. Man does not usually put himself in the middle of other people's business. He said he owed Thomas a debt. Maybe he did. Constance's tone suggested she doubted it, or perhaps suggested there was more to the story than debt alone, but she did not press further, and Jennie was too exhausted to ask. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed beneath an unfamiliar quilt while rain drummed against the roof, Jennie opened her satchel and drew out her journal, the same leather-bound book she had kept faithfully since she was 16 years old, recording thoughts too private or too raw to speak aloud. She uncapped her ink and began to write by candlelight. I do not know what to make of Mr. Lockhart. He paid a debt of over $400 for a woman he has never met, and then rode away as though he had done nothing more than hold open a door. I ought to be grateful, and I am, but I am also unsettled, because gratitude that comes without understanding feels like standing on ground I cannot see beneath the water. Thomas never mentioned him in his letters, not once, not even in passing, and yet this man speaks of a debt owed as though it were an old and settled fact between them. I mean to find out what that debt was, and I mean to repay whatever remains, because I did not come to this valley to be rescued. I came to open a school, and I intend to open it, mining company or no mining company. She blew out the candle and lay in the dark listening to the rain, and against her will, she found herself picturing the stranger's face again, the weathered brown eyes, the quiet certainty in his voice, and she fell asleep before she could decide whether that memory troubled her or comforted her. The schoolhouse, when she finally walked out to see it the next morning, broke her heart before it lifted it. It stood on a rise above the river, a good solid structure with real glass windows, but the roof had begun to sag under 3 seasons of neglect, and half the shingles had blown away in some autumn storm Thomas had never lived to repair. The single room inside smelled of mildew and mouse droppings. The desks Thomas had built by hand stacked haphazardly against one wall, and a hole gaped in the north corner of the roof large enough to let daylight and rain pour through in equal measure. She stood in the doorway with her hands on her hips, cataloging the damage the way she might have once graded an essay, methodically and without flinching, though tears pricked at the corners of her eyes despite her best effort to hold them back. This was supposed to have been Thomas's gift to her, this small, imperfect, hopeful place, and now it stood ruined and mortgaged both, and she had 30 days to save it from a company that had already, by all accounts, driven her husband into an early grave through some scheme involving a bad mining claim. She was still standing there, calculating lumber costs in her head and coming up hopelessly short, when she heard hoofbeats on the muddy track behind her and turned to see Wyatt Lockhart dismounting from the same bay horse, this time with a coil of rope and a canvas sack of tools slung over one broad shoulder. "Mr. Lockhart." She straightened, suddenly self-conscious about the tears she had not quite managed to blink away. "I did not expect to see you again so soon. Figured the roof would need looking at before winter set in proper." He glanced up at the sagging shingles with the flat, assessing look of a man who had spent a lifetime reading structures the way other men read books. "Thomas started this place with good bones, just never got the chance to finish it right. You knew him well then, more than you let on yesterday." Something flickered across Wyatt's face, quick and gone. "Knew him well enough. Mr. Lockhart, I appreciate what you did at the bank more than I have properly said, but I cannot accept more charity from a stranger. I do not even understand the nature of the debt you claim to owe him." Wyatt set down his sack of tools with a heavy thud and looked at her directly, and there was something almost amused in the set of his mouth, though his eyes remained serious. "Ma'am, I am not offering charity. I am offering labor, which is a different thing entirely, and I would remind you that a roof this size, done proper, would cost you more in lumber and time than you have got, given the company is fixing to foreclose on you inside a month. How do you know about the mining company's claim? Small town. News travels faster than the mail." He crouched down to examine the foundation stones along the schoolhouse's north wall, running a broad, calloused hand along the mortar joints with the careful attention of a man checking a horse's leg for injury. "Cascade Mining Company holds paper on half this valley, Mrs. Hart. Your husband was not the only man who signed something he should not have, trying to keep a family afloat when the mine started cutting wages and running men into debt at the company store faster than they could earn it out." Jennie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "You are saying the company traps its workers deliberately." "I am saying a man goes down into that mine owing the company for his boots, his blasting powder and his flour, and comes up owing more than he went down with, on account of prices at the store climbing every season while wages stay flat as a lake in August." Wyatt straightened, brushing dirt from his palms. Your Thomas was not a miner, but he did surveying work for them, and got paid partly in mining scrip instead of coin, scrip that is worth nothing outside the company store. When the roof needed fixing and the lumber needed buying, he had no real money to do it with, so he borrowed against the school deed, thinking he would pay it back once the surveying contract finished. But he died before it finished. He died before it finished, Wyatt confirmed, and something rough entered his voice that told Jennie there was more to this story than mere business acquaintance, something closer to grief carefully contained. You cared for him. He was a good man in a bad situation, same as a lot of folks in this valley. Wyatt turned back toward the roof, effectively ending that particular line of conversation, though Jennie noted it and filed it away, the way she filed away every piece of evidence when trying to understand a difficult pupil. I can have this roof patched within the week if you will let me, and I know 2 other men, Silas Boone and his boy, who will help for fair wages, which I intend to pay myself. And no, before you object again, it is not charity. It is investment. This valley needs a school worse than it needs another empty building falling in on itself. Jennie studied him for a long moment, rain beginning to spit down again from a sky the color of wet slate, and something in her, some part of her that had spent years being told a proper woman waited to be helped rather than negotiated the terms of that help, decided to simply be direct. If you are going to spend your labor and your money on this school, Mr. Lockhart, then I am going to spend mine as well. I will not sit in the boarding house sewing samplers while you rebuild my husband's schoolhouse. I can hammer a nail as well as any man, and I intend to learn how to shingle a roof by the end of this week, whether you teach me or not. For the first time since she had met him, Wyatt Lockhart laughed, a short, surprised sound that transformed his weathered face entirely, softening the hard lines around his mouth. Never met a schoolteacher who wanted to climb up on a roof before. Then you have not met very many schoolteachers, Mr. Lockhart. We are made of sterner stuff than most people credit us with. Apparently so. He looked at her a moment longer, something considering and warmer than before moving behind his eyes, and then he hefted his tool sack again and started toward the ladder propped against the schoolhouse wall. Well then, Mrs. Hart, let us see what you are made of. The week that followed passed in a blur of physical labor, unlike anything Jennie had experienced in her comfortable Portland upbringing or her careful Seattle years. Wyatt arrived each morning before full daylight, sometimes with Silas Boone and his lanky 15-year-old son Amos in tow, sometimes alone, and together they stripped the rotted shingles from the schoolhouse roof and replaced them with fresh cedar shakes that Wyatt split himself from timber off his own land, refusing payment for the wood no matter how firmly Jennie insisted. She learned to drive a nail true on the 3rd day, after smashing her thumb twice and biting back tears of frustration both times rather than let anyone see her cry over something so small. Wyatt had noticed anyway, crouching beside her on the roof's steep pitch with an ease that still startled her, given his size, the way a man that broad and heavy could move across a rooftop with the light-footed balance of a much smaller creature. Grip lower on the handle, he told her, not unkindly, adjusting her hand with his own, his palm rough and warm and enormous around her fingers for just a moment before he withdrew it. Let the hammer do the work. You are fighting it like it owes you money. Everyone in this valley seems to owe someone money, she said, and he almost smiled. Ain't that the truth? He watched her try again, and this time the nail sank clean and true on the first strike, and something in his face showed genuine approval, the kind she remembered from her own best teachers, the kind that made a person want to try harder simply to see it again. There you go, Mrs. Hart. You will have this roof shingled before Boone's boy manages it at this rate. High praise indeed, she said, and he laughed again, that same short, surprised sound, and something warm settled in her chest that she was not yet ready to examine too closely. In the evenings, exhausted and smelling of cedar sap and rain, Jennie retreated to her room at the boarding house and continued the habit of her journal, though now the entries had begun to shift in character, less about grief and uncertainty, more about the strange, unhurried man who had inserted himself so thoroughly into her difficulties. "He does not speak more than he must," she wrote one evening, the candle guttering low. "He answers questions plainly and then falls silent again, as though words cost him something precious that he does not care to spend carelessly. And yet I have watched him with Amos Boone, patient beyond what the boy's clumsiness deserves, and I have watched him handle the timber with a kind of reverence, running his hands over the grain before he cuts it, as though he is asking the wood's permission. I find myself watching for these small moments the way I used to watch for the first sign of understanding dawning on a struggling pupil's face. I do not know what to call this feeling growing in me. I only know that I look forward to the mornings more than I have any right to, given that my husband is not yet 2 months in his grave, and I am ashamed of how little that shame actually restrains me." She was more honest in that journal than she had been with another living soul in years, and though she told herself the pages were private, meant for no eyes but her own, there remained something almost dangerous in committing such feelings to paper at all, as though naming them might make them more true than she was prepared for. Wyatt, for his part, kept his own counsel in a different way. He was not a man given to journals or letters, having buried that particular habit along with his wife 6 years earlier, but he found himself thinking of Jennie Hart at odd hours, while mending fence line or hauling feed to his cattle through the cold mud of November, and he did not entirely know what to do with the thinking. His ranch sat 2 miles up the ridge from town, a modest spread of grazing land and timber he had built up slowly since arriving in the territory as a younger man, back when the whole valley had been little more than a handful of cabins strung along the river. His wife, Sarah, had died the winter after they married, taken by influenza in a season that had claimed a dozen others in the valley besides, and Wyatt had spent the 6 years since working the ranch alone, letting the labor fill the silence that Sarah's absence had left behind. He had told himself, in the way a man tells himself things to survive a loss, that he had done his loving already, that the rest of his life belonged to the work and the mountains and nothing more complicated than that. Then Jennie Hart had stood in the rain outside the bank, chin lifted, refusing to be cowed by Prout or the crowd or her own grief, and something in Wyatt that he had thought long since settled had stirred awake again, unwelcome and undeniable. He told himself it was only the debt he owed Thomas, and for the first several days that had been mostly true or true enough to believe. Thomas Hart had, in fact, saved Wyatt's life 2 winters back, when a felled cedar had shifted wrong and pinned Wyatt's leg beneath its trunk in the freezing mud, and it had been Thomas who found him. Thomas who worked for 3 desperate hours to lever the trunk free with nothing but a peavey and sheer stubbornness, likely saving both the leg and the man. Wyatt had never properly repaid that debt, had always meant to, and Thomas's death had left the account unsettled in a way that gnawed at him. Paying off the widow's debt at the bank had felt, in that first moment, like the only decent thing a man could do. But by the second week of working alongside Jennie Hart, watching her learn to shingle a roof with the same fierce determination she likely brought to every difficult thing in her life, watching her patience with Amos Boone when the boy grew frustrated and clumsy, watching the quick intelligence behind her eyes when she asked Wyatt pointed questions about the mining company's operations that no one else in town had thought to ask, Wyatt had to admit to himself, alone in his cabin at night with only the fire and his own thoughts for company, that this had stopped being only about Thomas Hart a long time ago. The schoolhouse roof was finished by the second Saturday, tight and weatherproof, and the following week they turned their attention to the interior, replacing rotted floorboards and rebuilding the small stove's chimney flue, which had cracked sometime during the neglected months and posed a real fire risk if left unrepaired. It was during this work that the first real trouble arrived, in the form of a well-dressed man on a fine black horse, who rode up to the schoolhouse one gray Tuesday afternoon with 2 hired men trailing behind him. Jennie recognized him before Wyatt spoke his name, recognized the quality of his coat and the careless authority of his posture as belonging to a man accustomed to being obeyed. Wyatt's whole body had gone rigid beside her, the easy warmth that had grown between them over the past 2 weeks replaced instantly by something hard and watchful. "Mr. Calloway," Wyatt said, and there was no welcome in it at all. Harrison Calloway, owner and operator of the Cascade Mining Company, dismounted with unhurried grace and surveyed the schoolhouse with an expression of mild, proprietary interest, as though inspecting livestock he intended to purchase. He was perhaps 50, silver-templed and clean-shaven, with the soft hands of a man who had not done physical labor in a great many years, if ever. "Mrs. Hart, I presume." He touched the brim of his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I had heard the widow of my former surveyor had arrived in town. My condolences on your loss. Thomas was a valuable man." "Valuable enough that you paid him in scrip he could not spend outside your own store," Jennie said, her voice steady despite the anger rising hot beneath her ribs. Calloway's smile did not waver. "Business arrangements, Mrs. Hart, are rarely as simple as they appear from the outside. I understand you have engaged Mr. Lockhart's assistance in repairing this property, which I find curious, given that the property in question currently secures a debt of $218 owed to my company. I would hate for improvements made to land that may soon revert to my ownership to go to waste." "The debt is not due for another 2 weeks," Jennie said. "I intend to pay it in full before that deadline." "Of course you do." Calloway's eyes moved briefly to Wyatt, something calculating passing behind them. "Though I understand Mr. Lockhart has already been rather generous with his coin on your behalf at the bank. I wonder how deep those particular pockets run, and whether they run deep enough to cover $218 on top of the $400 already spent." "That is none of your concern, Calloway," Wyatt said, his voice a low warning. "On the contrary, it is very much my concern, since I have men in that mine who are owed wages I have not yet found convenient to pay, on account of certain unexpected expenses this season, ventilation repairs and the like." Calloway's smile finally slipped, just slightly, revealing something colder beneath the practiced charm. "I would think carefully, Mr. Lockhart, about how visibly you choose to interfere in matters that do not concern you. This valley depends on my mine for a great many things, and men who make themselves troublesome sometimes find their own business suffering unexpected difficulties." The threat hung plain in the cold air between them, and Jennie felt her pulse quicken with genuine alarm, but Wyatt did not so much as flinch. "Is that so?" he said, and something in his tone made even Calloway's 2 hired men shift uneasily in their saddles. "Funny thing about difficulties, Calloway. They have a way of finding the men who cause them, sooner or later. You might keep that in mind yourself, given how many men in that mine of yours have started talking about the air down in the lower shaft." Something flickered across Calloway's face, gone almost before Jennie could read it, but she caught it, filed it away the way she had filed away the earlier evidence of Wyatt's history with Thomas. Ventilation repairs, men talking about the air. There was something there, something Calloway did not want examined too closely. "I am sure I do not know what you mean," Calloway said, mounting his horse with slightly less grace than he had dismounted. 2 weeks, Mrs. Hart. I would suggest you have the full amount ready in coin, not scrip, or this property becomes company holding, improvements and all." He touched his hat brim once more, an insult disguised as courtesy, and rode off with his 2 men trailing behind, leaving a silence in their wake that felt heavier than before their arrival. "What did you mean?" Jennie asked once the riders had disappeared around the bend. "About the air in the lower shaft." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, staring after Calloway's retreating figure with an expression she had not seen on him before, something grim and old and tired. "Thomas mentioned it to me before he died. Said the surveying work he was doing was not just for new tunnels. Said Calloway had him mapping air shafts that were supposed to be dug 2 years back and never were on account of the cost, Said miners had been getting sick, coughing blood some of them, and Calloway kept telling the foreman it was just the dust, nothing to worry over. That sounds like more than dust, Mr. Lockhart. That is what Thomas thought too. Wyatt's jaw tightened. He was gathering proof before the fever took him. Papers, measurements, testimony from a couple of the miners willing to talk. Was fixing to bring it to the territorial mining inspector in Seattle once he had enough to make the case airtight. Jennie's breath caught. Do you know where those papers are? No. Thought they might have died with him, honestly, until you mentioned the school being mortgaged. Now I am wondering if maybe Calloway wanted this property back for more reason than the debt alone. Maybe he was hoping to search it, once it fell back into company hands, and found nothing of use here yet, so he is applying pressure to force the sale faster. The pieces settled into place in Jennie's mind with the satisfying, terrible click of a puzzle finally solved. Thomas would not have kept anything so important where Calloway's men might stumble across it easily. He would have hidden it somewhere safe. Somewhere only he, or someone he trusted completely, would think to look. Any idea where that might be? Jennie thought of the letters Thomas had sent her over the past 2 years, careful and dutiful and never quite as warm as she had hoped for, describing the schoolhouse's progress in detail that had, at the time, seemed like simple pride in his work. Now those descriptions took on new weight in her memory. He wrote to me about a loose floorboard beneath the stove, she said slowly. Said he had built a small storage space there to keep valuable school supplies dry and safe from mice. I thought nothing of it at the time. They found it within the hour. Prying up the floorboard Wyatt had already noticed was slightly loose during the earlier repairs, but had not thought to investigate further. Beneath it lay a tin box, rusted at the corners but intact, containing a thick sheaf of papers in Thomas's careful surveying hand, measurements and diagrams of the mine's ventilation shafts, notes documenting 3 separate instances of miners reporting breathing difficulties and blood in their coughs, and 2 signed statements from miners willing to testify that Calloway had been informed of the dangerous conditions repeatedly and had refused to authorize repairs, citing cost. Jennie sat back on her heels, staring at the evidence spread across the schoolhouse floor, feeling the weight of what Thomas had been trying to accomplish, the courage it must have taken a company surveyor to gather proof against his own employer, knowing the risk it posed to his livelihood and possibly his safety. He was trying to save those men, she said quietly. Even while he was sick, he was still trying to finish this. Man had more courage than sense sometimes, Wyatt said, though his voice was gentle now, none of the earlier hardness remaining. Reminds me of someone else I have met recently, come to think of it. Jennie looked up at him and found him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch, something warm and unguarded that she had not seen from him before. I take that as a compliment, Mr. Lockhart. Meant it as one, Mrs. Hart. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither of them had yet found words for, until the practical urgency of the situation reasserted itself, and Jennie carefully gathered the papers back into their tin box. We need to get this to the territorial mining inspector before Calloway realizes it exists, she said. And we need to pay off the school's debt before he can force the sale, so he has no legal claim to search this property at all. That is $218 we do not currently have, Wyatt pointed out, though not unkindly. Then we will find a way to get it. There is a livestock market in 3 weeks, is there not, up at the mountain crossing? Constance mentioned it at the boarding house. Ranchers from 3 counties bring their cattle to sell before winter fully sets in. There is. Cattle prices run decent this time of year before the pass is close. Wyatt studied her, understanding dawning. You are thinking to sell stock. I am thinking you have cattle, Mr. Lockhart, and I have determination, and together that might add up to $218 faster than either of us expects. She met his eyes steadily. I will not let you carry this debt alone. If you are willing to sell stock toward it, I intend to work off my share, teaching sums to every rancher's child in this valley who needs help with figures, mending clothes, whatever honest labor this town requires until I have earned my portion honestly." Wyatt looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his weathered eyes, and then he nodded slowly. "All right, Mrs. Hart, we will do this together then." "Together," she agreed, and the words settled between them with a weight that felt like the beginning of something neither of them had quite named yet. The 3 weeks that followed passed in a rush of preparation, the whole valley bending itself toward the mountain crossing market the way settlements always did before the passes closed for winter, everyone racing against the calendar to trade and sell, and stock up before the snow made travel impossible until spring. Wyatt spent long days gathering his cattle down from the high pastures, and Jennie, true to her word, spent her mornings teaching sums and letters to any child whose parents could spare an hour, earning small coins and sometimes only gratitude, both of which she accepted with equal grace. In the evenings, when the work allowed, she and Wyatt sat together at the schoolhouse or occasionally at his ranch, poring over Thomas's papers, drafting the letter that would accompany them to the territorial mining inspector. And it was during these quiet hours that something else began to grow between them, something neither work nor debt could fully explain. "You loved her very much," Jennie said one evening, watching Wyatt's face as he mentioned his late wife Sarah in passing, some small memory triggered by the way the firelight caught the schoolhouse's new floorboards. "Sarah." Wyatt was quiet for a moment, and Jennie thought perhaps she had overstepped, but then he spoke, slow and careful, like a man handling something fragile. "We were married less than a year when the fever took her. Sometimes I think I remember her less clearly than I remember the grief of losing her, if that makes any sense. Like the missing became bigger than the memory itself." "That makes a great deal of sense," Jennie said softly. "Thomas and I were married barely 6 months before he came out here ahead of me. I find myself grieving him honestly, and grieving too the marriage we never quite got the chance to build. I do not know if that is a strange thing to admit." "Not strange at all." Wyatt looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made her feel seen in a manner she had not experienced in a very long time. "Seems to me grief comes in a lot of different shapes, Mrs. Hart. Does not have to match exactly what folks expect it to look like." "Jennie," she said suddenly. "You may call me Jennie, Mr. Lockhart. I think we have moved well past the point of such formality between us." Something warmed in his eyes. "Jennie then. And I suppose you had better call me Wyatt." "Wyatt," she repeated, testing the shape of it, and found she liked it very much indeed. It was 2 nights before the market, with the cattle gathered and counted, and the papers finally sealed into a proper envelope addressed to the Territorial Mining Inspector's office in Seattle, that Jennie finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been troubling her since the very first day. "Wyatt, I need to ask you something honestly, and I need you to answer honestly in return." He set down the cup of coffee he had been drinking, his expression turning serious. "All right. That first day at the bank. You said you owed Thomas a debt, and I know now about the felled cedar, about him saving your leg, and I understand why you felt obligated to help. But I do not think that is the whole of it. I have watched you these past weeks, Wyatt, watched the care you take with this school, with the town's children, with me, and I do not think a debt alone explains all of that." She held his gaze steadily, refusing to look away despite the vulnerability of the question. "Why did you truly step in that day?" Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness she had not heard from him before. "Because I watched you standing in that rain, refusing to back down from a bank and an entire crowd of men who would not lift a finger to help you, and something in me that has been asleep a long time woke up and would not let me walk away. I told myself it was the debt to Thomas, because that was easier to say out loud, easier to justify to myself. But the truth is, Jennie, I have been alone on that ranch for 6 years, telling myself I did not need anything more than the work and the mountains. And then you showed up in the middle of that storm looking like you would rather die than be pitied, and I have not been able to stop thinking about you since." The confession hung in the air between them, honest and unguarded in a way that made Jennie's heart pound against her ribs. "I have not been entirely honest with myself either," she admitted quietly. "I told myself I was only grateful to you, that whatever I felt was simply the natural warmth one feels toward a generous friend. But I have written things in my journal these past weeks that I would be mortified to have anyone read, Wyatt. Things about watching you work, about looking forward to seeing you each morning far more than proper mourning allows." "Jennie, I am not finished," she said, though gently. "I do not know what is proper, given how recently I was widowed, given how briefly Thomas and I were actually married before circumstances separated us. But I know that what I feel for you does not feel like a betrayal of his memory. It feels like something entirely separate, something that grew here in this valley, alongside all of this work and worry, and I do not wish to pretend otherwise any longer simply because propriety suggests I should." Wyatt crossed the small distance between them and took her hand in his enormous, calloused palm swallowing hers entirely, and yet the touch was so gentle it made her breath catch. "I have not felt anything like this since Sarah," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he had clearly not expected to feel again in his lifetime. "I did not think I would. I had made my peace with a life that was only work and mountains and quiet, and you have gone and disturbed all of that, Jennie Hart, in the best possible way a person can be disturbed. Is that a complaint, Mr. Lockhart?" "That," he said, and finally smiled, wide and unguarded, "is a fact I intend to be grateful for as long as you will let me." He kissed her then, careful and slow, as though she were something precious he did not wish to startle away, and Jennie leaned into it with a certainty that surprised her, all her careful teacher's caution set aside in favor of something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and simply right. They did not rush what came after, both of them too aware of the gravity of grief and time and propriety to move faster than felt honest. But something had shifted permanently between them that night. An understanding reached that whatever else happened with the debt and the mine and the coming market, they would face it together now, not as widow and rescuer, but as two people who had found, unexpectedly, something worth protecting in each other. The mountain crossing market arrived on a morning of hard frost and pale, watery sunlight, the first clear sky the valley had seen in nearly a month. Ranchers from 3 counties had gathered in the wide meadow at the crossing, cattle penned in makeshift corrals, wagons loaded with produce and goods, the whole scene alive with the particular energy of a community racing to complete its business before winter sealed the mountain passes shut. Jennie walked among the crowds at Wyatt's side, watching him negotiate cattle prices with a shrewdness that belied his usual quiet manner, watching the respect other ranchers showed him, and felt a quiet pride in being seen beside him that she had not expected. They had brought 40 head of cattle to sell, a significant portion of Wyatt's herd, and by midday the sales had gone well enough that they were within $30 of the full amount needed for the school's debt. Jennie herself had set up a small table near the market's edge, offering to write letters and do sums for anyone who needed such services, and had earned a respectable $11 by early afternoon, mostly from ranchers wanting letters written to family back east. It was in the middle of this productive, hopeful afternoon that Harrison Calloway arrived, riding into the market square with 4 hired men behind him, and something about the deliberate way he positioned himself at the center of the gathering, drawing attention rather than avoiding it, sent a cold warning through Jennie's chest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Calloway called out, his voice pitched to carry across the whole meadow, silencing conversations as heads turned toward him. "I apologize for interrupting your business, but I have an announcement that concerns every family in this valley." Wyatt appeared at Jennie's side instantly, his hand finding hers, his whole body coiled with tension though his face remained carefully neutral. "As many of you know," Calloway continued, "the Cascade Mining Company has been the backbone of this valley's economy for 8 years now. but I regret to inform you that due to certain reckless accusations being spread by parties with personal grudges against me, I am considering closing the mine's operations entirely, effective immediately, which would eliminate over 60 jobs in this valley heading into the hardest months of winter." A wave of alarmed murmuring swept through the crowd, exactly as Calloway had clearly intended. Jennie felt her stomach drop, understanding immediately what he was doing, turning the town's own fear and dependency into a weapon against her, and Wyatt in the most public possible venue. "He knows about the papers," she whispered to Wyatt. "Must have searched the schoolhouse after we left, found the loose board disturbed." Wyatt's jaw was tight with barely restrained anger. "He is trying to turn the whole valley against us before we can even get the evidence to Seattle." Calloway's eyes found them in the crowd, and his smile turned cold and deliberate. "I understand Mrs. Hart and Mr. Lockhart have been spreading stories about unsafe conditions in my mine. I would remind everyone present that these are the same two people who have been conducting an improper relationship not 2 months after Mrs. Hart's husband was buried. Hardly the moral authorities this valley should be trusting with such serious accusations." The crowd's murmur shifted, uncertain now, some faces turning toward Jennie and Wyatt with open speculation and judgment, and Jennie felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame but from fury at how neatly Calloway had turned their private happiness into a public weapon. But before she could speak, before Wyatt could move, an older man pushed forward from the crowd, a miner by the look of his coal-scarred hands and hollow, coughing chest, a man Jennie recognized from Thomas's papers as one of the two who had signed statements about the mine's dangerous conditions. "That is a fine speech, Calloway," the man called out, his voice rough but carrying clearly across the meadow. "But it does not change the fact that my brother died coughing blood 8 months back, working in that lower shaft you never bothered to ventilate proper. And it does not change the fact that you knew and did nothing, because fixing it would have cost you money you did not want to spend." The crowd's attention swung entirely to the miner now, and Calloway's confident expression flickered for the first time. "Ezra Tull, you sign no such accusation," Calloway said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness. "I signed a statement for Thomas Hart before he passed," Ezra said, stepping fully into the open space between the crowd and Calloway's mounted men. "Told him everything I know, and I will tell this whole valley the same thing right now, standing here, since you have decided to make this public business instead of quiet business. You knew about the bad air. You knew men were getting sick. And you let it keep happening because new ventilation shafts would have cost you 2 months' profit." Another miner stepped forward beside Ezra, and then a third, their collective courage building now that the first had spoken, and Jennie watched with a fierce, swelling pride as Wyatt stepped forward as well, drawing the tin box of papers from inside his coat where he had carried it, apparently anticipating exactly this kind of confrontation might arise. "These are Thomas Hart's own surveys," Wyatt announced, holding the box aloft so the gathered crowd could see it. "Measurements of the shafts Calloway was told needed digging 2 years back and never did. Statements from miners willing to testify to the territorial inspector. Thomas died before he could deliver these himself, but Mrs. Hart and I intend to see they reach Seattle regardless, because 60 jobs are not worth more than 60 lives, and every family in this valley deserves to know the truth about the ground their husbands and sons are working beneath." Calloway's composure finally cracked entirely, his face flushing dark with anger. "Those papers are stolen company property, and I will see you both arrested for theft and slander." "They are not company property," Jennie said, stepping forward to stand beside Wyatt, her voice ringing out clear and steady across the silenced meadow. "They are the honest work of a surveyor documenting hazardous conditions, and if you have nothing to hide, Mr. Calloway, you have nothing to fear from an honest inspection. But if you try to stop this evidence from reaching Seattle, That alone will tell this entire valley everything it needs to know about your guilt." The crowd had turned entirely now, the earlier speculative judgment replaced by something harder and more dangerous directed squarely at Calloway, and Jennie watched the man's hired guns shift uneasily in their saddles, clearly recalculating whether this situation was worth whatever wages Calloway was paying them. "This is not finished," Calloway said, his voice low and venomous, though he was already gathering his reins, recognizing the crowd's shifted mood as a threat he was not prepared to face directly. "I have friends in the territorial government, Mr. Lockhart. This will not go the way you think it will." "Then we will let the inspector decide that," Wyatt said, unmoved, "instead of you and your friends deciding it in some back room." Calloway rode off with his men trailing behind him, considerably less confident than his arrival, and the moment he cleared the meadow's edge, the crowd erupted into a chaos of urgent conversation, miners and ranchers alike crowding around Wyatt and Jennie with questions, and in a few cases, quiet apologies for the earlier speculation about their relationship. "You should have seen his face," Ezra Tull said to Wyatt, something like real relief in his rough voice. "Man has had this valley scared silent for 8 years. Good to see someone finally push back." "Could not have done it without you standing up first, Ezra," Wyatt said, gripping the older man's shoulder. "Took real courage, saying that in front of the whole valley. Man does what he has to when it is his brother's memory on the line." Ezra looked between Wyatt and Jennie, something knowing in his weathered eyes. "As for what Calloway said about you two, none of my business, but for what it is worth, seems to me a man could do a lot worse than a woman brave enough to stand up in a market square like that." Jennie felt heat rise in her cheeks again, though this time from something warmer than anger, and beside her, Wyatt's hand found hers again, squeezing gently, unashamed now in front of the whole gathered valley. They finished selling the remaining cattle by late afternoon, the crowd's mood having shifted entirely in their favor, several ranchers even offering better prices than market rate as a quiet gesture of support. By the time the sun began sinking toward the western ridges, painting the frost-covered meadow in shades of gold and rose, they had raised not only the $218 needed for the school's debt, but an additional $40 besides, which Wyatt insisted should go toward proper school supplies rather than back into his own pocket. "You did not have to do that," Jennie said as they loaded the last of the unsold goods onto Wyatt's wagon, the meadow slowly emptying as families packed up for the journey home before dark. "I know I did not have to," Wyatt said. "Wanted to. There is a difference, same as I told you back at the bank that first day. You are going to have to teach me to recognize that difference eventually, Wyatt Lockhart, because I confess I still cannot always tell it apart from stubbornness." He laughed, that same warm, surprised sound she had come to treasure over the past weeks. "Might be some stubbornness mixed in there too, if I am being honest." They rode back toward town together as the last light faded from the sky, the papers safely secured for the journey to Seattle, the debt nearly settled, and something between them settled as well, quiet and certain. The way a foundation settles once the weight it was built to bear finally comes to rest upon it. The letter to the territorial mining inspector went out on the last mail wagon before the mountain passes closed for winter, carried by a rider who made the journey to Seattle in 4 hard days. And the response, when it finally came 6 weeks later carried back up the reopened spring passes, confirmed everything Jennie and Wyatt had hoped for. An inspector had been dispatched to examine the Cascade Mining Company's operations, had found the ventilation conditions exactly as documented in Thomas's careful surveys, and had ordered the mine closed for mandatory repairs, with Calloway facing significant fines and the very real possibility of criminal charges for endangerment, given the documented deaths and illnesses among his workforce. Several miners, including Ezra Tull, had been retained on full wages during the repair period by order of the territorial government, a small but meaningful justice for men who had risked their livelihoods to speak the truth. But that news arrived only after a long winter had first passed, a winter that Jennie and Wyatt spent building something else entirely, slower and quieter than the drama of the mine or the market, but no less important to the story of what they were becoming together. The schoolhouse debt was paid in full the week after the market, Prout issuing a formal deed transfer back into Jennie's name, with considerably more courtesy than he had shown on their first meeting, likely due to the changed opinion of him circulating through the valley after Calloway's public humiliation. With the property secured, Jennie turned her full attention to preparing the school for its actual purpose, gathering donated books and slates from families throughout the valley, finishing the interior repairs with Wyatt's continued help, and slowly, methodically, building toward the day she had crossed the entire territory to see the opening of the Cedar Falls Settlement School. Through the deepening winter, as snow settled thick over the valley and the passes closed entirely, cutting the town off from easy travel until spring, Jennie and Wyatt's courtship deepened in the unhurried way that suited them both. He taught her to track deer sign through fresh snow, an oddly tender lesson delivered with the same patient care he had shown teaching her to shingle a roof. And she taught him, in turn, to read more fluently, a private admission he had made one evening by the fire, confessing that his own schooling had been sparse and interrupted, that he had always felt the lack of it as a kind of quiet shame he had never spoken aloud to anyone before her. "There is no shame in it," she told him gently, sitting close beside him at his ranch's kitchen table, a borrowed primer open between them. "Circumstance is not the same as failing, Wyatt. You have built an entire ranch with your own 2 hands, kept it thriving alone for 6 years. That takes a different kind of intelligence than reading quickly, and no less valuable." "Never had anyone say that to me before," he admitted, something vulnerable in his voice that she had rarely heard from him. "Sarah could not read much either, truth be told. We never had reason to think much on it." "Well, I intend to think on it, because I think you are entirely capable of reading as well as any man in this valley, given proper instruction and enough patience, and I have an abundance of both to offer." He kissed her then, softly, gratefully, and she felt in that kiss the particular tenderness of a man unaccustomed to being cared for in such a specific, deliberate way. And something in her heart ached with how much she wanted to keep offering him exactly that kind of care for as long as he would let her. They exchanged letters, too, that winter, despite living close enough to visit regularly, a habit that began almost by accident when a heavy snowstorm kept Jennie confined to the boarding house for 4 days, and Wyatt, unable to visit in person, sent a note instead by way of Amos Boone, who trudged through the drifts delivering messages between them like a determined young postal service of one. "I find I think of you at strange hours," Wyatt wrote in his careful, still developing hand, the letters slightly uneven but perfectly legible. "When I am mending fence, or feeding stock, or sitting alone by the fire, same as I have done for 6 winters now, except it does not feel the same anymore, because now the quiet feels like waiting instead of just quiet. I never expected to feel this again, Jennie, and I do not entirely know what to do with feeling it, except to tell you plainly, since you have taught me that plain honesty is worth more than careful silence." She kept every letter, tucked carefully between the pages of her journal, and answered each one with equal honesty, finding in the written word a courage that sometimes eluded her in person, some old habit from her teaching days of trusting the page more readily than the voice. "I have spent my whole life believing that love should look a certain way," she wrote back, "that it should announce itself with grand gestures and swift certainty. What I have found instead with you is something quieter and, I think, far more durable. You do not sweep me off my feet, Wyatt Lockhart. You simply stand beside me, steady as those mountains you love so well, and somehow that steadiness has become the thing I trust most in this world. I did not come to this valley looking for love. I came looking for purpose. I find myself deeply grateful that I managed to find both. The school finally opened on a bright, cold morning in early March, as the last snow began melting from the valley floor and the first green shoots of skunk cabbage pushed up through the mud along the riverbank. 12 children arrived that first morning, ranging from 6 to 14 years old, sons and daughters of ranchers and loggers, and 2 families of the local tribal community who had been welcomed with particular warmth by Jennie, who had insisted from the very beginning that her school would turn no child away regardless of background. Wyatt stood at the back of the schoolroom that first morning, having come to help light the new stove and ensure the chimney drew properly, and watched Jennie stand before her assembled pupils with a confidence and warmth that filled his chest with something he could only describe as quiet, overwhelming pride. She moved among the children with the same patient attention she had once shown him, correcting a slate here, offering encouragement there, and he understood, watching her, that this was who she truly was at her core, a woman built for exactly this kind of purposeful, generous work, and he felt profoundly grateful to have found a place in the story of her building it. After the children had been dismissed for the midday meal, Jennie joined Wyatt outside the schoolhouse, both of them looking out over the valley spread below, the river running high with snowmelt, the cedar forests dark and endless along the ridgelines, the whole landscape awakening slowly into spring. "I have something to ask you," Wyatt said, and something in his voice made Jennie turn to look at him fully, noting the unusual nervousness in his broad, capable hands. "You may ask me anything, Wyatt." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small ring, simple gold, clearly old, worn smooth at the edges in a way that suggested it had once belonged to someone else entirely. "This was my mother's ring. Carried it out west with me 20 years back, thinking someday I might have use for it. Gave up on that thought for a long while after Sarah passed." He turned it over in his rough fingers, and Jennie felt her breath catch, understanding suddenly what was coming. "I do not have fine words for this, Jennie. I am better with wood and stone and cattle than with speeches. You know that about me by now. But I know that I love you, plainly and completely, and I know that this valley feels different with you in it, and I know that I do not want to spend whatever years are left to me imagining a future that does not include you standing right beside me in it. Will you marry me?" Jennie felt tears rise, not from grief this time, but from a happiness so full it nearly overwhelmed her. "Wyatt Lockhart, I came to this valley to open a school and repay a debt, and I found instead the truest, steadiest love I have ever known, exactly where I least expected to find it. Yes, yes, I will marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly despite their usual steadiness, and then he kissed her there in the bright March sunlight, in full view of the schoolhouse he had helped rebuild and the valley he had spent a lifetime loving alone, and Jennie kissed him back with everything she had, feeling for the first time since Thomas's death, and perhaps for the first time in her entire adult life, that she had found exactly the place, and exactly the person she was meant to build a future alongside. They married 3 weeks later, a small ceremony held at the newly opened schoolhouse itself, attended by nearly the whole valley, from Constance Ferris weeping happily in the front row to Ezra Tull and his fellow miners, now working again in a mine made properly safe under new management after Calloway's forced sale of his interests, to Sela's and Amos Boone, and even Prout, considerably humbled by the winter's events, offering his congratulations with what appeared to be genuine warmth. Jennie wore a simple blue dress, practical rather than elaborate, and Wyatt wore a coat she had mended herself. And when the traveling minister who serviced several valley settlements pronounced them married, the whole gathered crowd erupted into cheering that echoed off the surrounding cedar-covered ridges, a sound of pure communal joy that Jennie thought she would remember for the rest of her life. They settled into a rhythm together that spring and summer that felt, to both of them, like the truest kind of happiness, the quiet, sustaining kind built on shared labor and mutual respect rather than dramatic gestures. Jennie continued teaching at the school, her class growing to 18 pupils by midsummer as word spread through the valley of the fine education being offered there. And Wyatt continued running his ranch, though now with Jennie's help managing the accounts and correspondence, her education proving useful in ways neither of them had initially anticipated. They built a small addition onto Wyatt's cabin that summer, working together on weekends with the same partnership they had shown rebuilding the schoolhouse roof the previous autumn, and Jennie found herself, one evening in late September, standing back to admire the finished addition with a satisfaction that ran far deeper than mere carpentry pride. "We make a fair team, Mrs. Lockhart," Wyatt said, coming to stand beside her, using her new name with obvious pleasure, as he had taken to doing at every opportunity since their wedding. "We do indeed, Mr. Lockhart." She leaned into his solid warmth, and he wrapped one strong arm around her shoulders, the two of them looking out over the ranch and the mountains beyond, as the autumn light began to soften toward evening. It was almost exactly a year after that first terrible day at the bank when Jennie found herself walking through the town of Cedar Falls on a crisp October morning. The same season, the same cold bite in the air, though everything else about the walk felt entirely transformed. She had business to attend at the very same bank, this time simply to deposit the school's modest tuition earnings and to collect a package of new primers that had arrived from Seattle. And as she walked up the same muddy street where she had once stood soaked and desperate, fighting to save her husband's legacy, she found herself pausing outside the bank's front steps, remembering. Wyatt was waiting for her there, having ridden into town separately to collect supplies, and he fell into step beside her as she emerged from the bank a few minutes later, package tucked beneath one arm. "You are thinking about that first day," he said, reading her expression with the ease of a man who had spent a year learning every nuance of her face. "I am," she admitted. "It feels strange, standing here now, remembering how frightened I was, how alone. I did not know then that everything I needed was about to walk toward me through the rain." "Neither did I," Wyatt said, taking her hand as they walked together down the same street, past the same shops, toward the same schoolhouse that now stood proud and whole on its rise above the river, no longer a source of danger or debt but simply, purely, a place of hope for the whole valley's children. "Thought I had already had my one great love and lost her, thought the rest of my life was just going to be work in mountains and quiet. Glad I was wrong about that, Jennie." "So am I," she said, and meant it with her entire heart. They walked together up the rise toward the schoolhouse, where the sound of children's voices drifted out through the newly repaired windows, reciting their afternoon lessons, and Jennie felt the same warmth she had felt every day since opening those doors, the profound satisfaction of purpose fulfilled. But now that warmth had company, a deeper contentment that came from having found, in this small mountain valley, not only her purpose but her partner, a man whose quiet strength had first revealed itself in an act of unasked-for generosity, and had only grown more evident with every trial they had faced together since. They paused at the edge of the schoolyard, watching through the window as the children bent industriously over their slates, and Wyatt slipped his arm around Jennie's waist, drawing her close against his solid warmth. "Debts all settled then," he said softly, an echo of that very first promise he had made to Prude a year before. "Every last one of them." "Every last one," Jennie agreed, tilting her face up to accept his kiss, there in the golden autumn light, in the exact place where their story had truly begun, no longer dangerous now, but simply, entirely home. The freezing rain that had once driven her into this valley, cold and grieving and uncertain, had given way over the seasons to something far gentler, and standing there in Wyatt Lockhart's arms, watching her students learn within the walls he had helped her save, Jennie Hart understood with complete certainty that she had found exactly what she had not known she was searching for. Not merely a debt repaid, but a life rebuilt, sturdy and lasting as the cedar beams holding up the schoolhouse roof above them, built to weather whatever storms might come together, for as long as they both should live.